I'm going to call on my next questioner
Thank
here.
you.
Can you
I'll
introduce
make
yourself?
it short. I know it's over actually. My name is
We
Eduardo
are going to
Diaz.
extend for a few minutes, and we are going to ask you, invite you all to stay for the reception afterwards. So we'll take a few more minutes. And
My name is Eduardo Diaz
understanding.
Sosa. I'm a Venezuelan national, human rights activist, and environmental activist. I've worked at the United Nations for 23 years. My question was very narrow. I love the work of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and it had to do with, I know that you track thousands of companies. In many of these countries in the Middle East and North Africa, the informal economy happens to be the biggest employer. And I wanted to know whether you guys also weigh the informal economy and how you reach out to participants in the informal economy when you are doing this incredible work, because I think that the impact that the informal economy has is just as great or greater than the impact of the companies that your center tracks.
Chris. Chris.
Mauricio?
Greg.
Greg. We're inviting Greg from the Resource Center to come and address that question.
Thanks very much. It's a great question. It's not an easy one. The answer is that directly we don't work on the informal economy because our model is really to spotlight the records of individual companies. And as we know, the informal economy is diffuse. There aren't single actors that you can point at. But the ways that we do include it is that the informal economy often ends up, either there are impacts of private sector directly on the informal economy, as we've been hearing in the garbage pickers case, or the informal economy feeds into the formal economy. So you have artisanal mines, for example, feeding into the supply chains of gold or other minerals. You have very small scale farms that feed into international agricultural and food product supply chains. So I think the way to think about the engagement with the informal economy is to think about how the relationships between those and private companies. And in many cases, well, certainly there are large parts of the informal economy that don't have that direct connection. There are large swaths of the informal economy where I do think there's a direct impact. And so we look at that, and often the NGOs that we work with are ones who represent local groups that are impacted by companies, whether it's small market sellers or small scale farmers or other people who are working on land whose farmland is being taken by large companies. So there is an impact between a relationship between the two, and when those informal economy sectors are organized into local NGOs and associations, then there are groups that we can work with directly to try to bring their concerns to a global audience.
My name is Ibrahim Katabi, and I'm a legal worker and a human rights activist with the main focus on Yemen. My question is, given that there is new democracies or developing democracies in the Middle East, are you doing anything in terms of laws that protect the environments, human rights, and worker rights, given that there are many new constitutions that are being drafted in Egypt and also in Yemen? And also, are you working with international the international community, especially countries that are given aid to those countries, to attach such laws and advocate with international donors to make sure that these laws are adopted by these countries? And the other part of the question is, are you doing anything to actually disconnect the labor unions from the governments? And I think it is about time right now in the Middle East. Thanks.
In short, yes.
In short.
I mean, in the transitional countries, one of the central focuses of Human Rights Watch's work is to work with the new governments that are passing a host of new laws in a variety of areas that affect not just civil and political rights, but specifically labor rights as well. And in fact, in Yemen, I recently met with the Minister of Legislative Affairs, who's a human rights activist himself, who has set out the task of revamping 13 of the country's laws within a year. And you know, that's a lot. It's a big, big, big undertaking. And even in non-transitional countries, we have been commenting on new draft laws, urging new laws, and in fact, Jordan recently made a tremendous legal change, which is to include migrant domestic workers, housemaids, within the protection of the labor laws, which even the United States doesn't do, and that is something that we were working very, very aggressively on for a while. So, in short, yes.
I would also chip in about the Business and Human Rights Resource Center that one of the features on the website of the Resource Center is a collection of information on legal accountability related to businesses that is looking at jurisprudence and cases from all over the world, and that includes all of the significant developments that are related to where there are laws where companies can be held accountable.
Thank you. I'm Martha Brady. I'm with the Population Council. We're an international NGO working in research, and I've had the good fortune of working in Egypt and some of the Middle East. And I'm mindful of, I don't want to be in between you and reception, so I'll be quick. A couple things strike me that Mary Robinson mentioned is sort of looking across different sectors and bringing in new actors and people in this community. And there's two things that strike me. Today is the International Day of the Girl Child, and I am at the Population Council, and so we are mindful of population. And one of the things we do know is we have the largest cohort of young people in the world today. And demographers call it the youth bulge, but I think it's really important, this cohort of young people and what kinds of economies they're going to have and what kinds of interactions they're going to have in civil society. And so I'm wondering, for any of the panelists, do you look, within your work, do you look at the role of young people in any of your work, or particularly how gender plays out in some of the work that you do?
I'll get that. Yes. No, I have some details for you. Actually, I think everyone has heard about the Saudi attempt to do these buildings in order to host all the women and young girls in order to access employment. I mean, yes, build them a building, put the women together and let them work. This is right, labor right. Do you want this? Of course, that's perfect. I mean, there are trends in the region that are really dangerous. And definitely the question of gender is one of the issues that we closely look at in the Middle East. I've mentioned that we kind of following up on the sexual harassment thing. We also follow up on this issue of Saudi Arabia, and when IKEA also removed from its catalogs all the photos of women when they just distributed the catalog in Saudi Arabia. Definitely these are alarming situations that we need to keep an eye, and every time something like this comes to our attention, we post it on the website, and if it needs a company response, we are going to definitely have a company response for that, or seek at least a company response. Thank you. Anything to add?
On child labor, Annabelle, maybe
Yeah.
And I guess just adding in terms of linking up organisations in that area, another of our information portals is on business and children. And what's been interesting there is that in that field we've seen a real kind of coming together recently of different groups working on children's rights, working on environmental issues or health issues around that particular subject. I know there are people representing UNICEF in the room, and UNICEF and Save the Children and the UN Global Compact, which is also represented here, recently developed principles on business and children's rights. So that's just one example of the increased activity in this field. So I totally agree it's important and that people need to collaborate in this area. So, thanks.
You have our final question. You better make it good.
Thank
So
you
that
all.
we can go for the
Okay,
wine.
thank you all for the work that you're doing. Just real quickly, how do we ensure that there isn't more of a race to the bottom in terms of incorporating more companies that represent states who may not even subscribe to some of the human rights and business responsibility issues that we have today? And I'm asking this question within the context that it's like a pendulum where we see swings toward very strong human rights dynamics, and then we see pushback. And I mean, just this week, we can see it where there's a lot of pushback against some of the Dodd-Frank attempts to be more transparent, to get energy and other resource companies to be more transparent. How do we ensure that we're not entering a period where the pendulum is swinging a little bit away from the values that you all are working so hard on?
That was good.
Well, you can't maybe. Yeah? Well, you can't be sure. I mean, with all human rights, you can't be sure about anything. If you're gonna sway from the basic principles or not, but you just go do your work and hope for the best. In most of the Arab countries, by the way, the companies are governmental, and we had lots of discussions within the center on how to treat them, because we work on only the private sector and human rights. But sometimes if these companies, like for example the oil companies in Libya or major government companies that function like private companies, we seek responses and we track them down and we work on them, exactly like private sector companies. But you can never be sure. I mean, just do your work and hope for the best.
If I could maybe just add briefly that's why it's important to have the resources that we have of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and indeed the Institute for Human Rights and Business, because we have the UN guiding principles now, which have been endorsed by the Human Rights Council, but they need to be implemented. And there's no real guarantee, I think, in human rights work that we'll make constant progress. On the contrary, it's always a struggle. It's always eternal vigilance. It's always making sure that there's a holding to account. And there are pressures. There is a huge pressure about, as we've heard, a bulge of young people and the need for jobs, the need for employment. But it mustn't be a sacrifice of labour standards, of health standards, of safety standards, of human rights standards in relation to business. And in fact, there is no real economic case for that. There's a cheap case made sometimes, but it's not a good economic case. And so I think we just have to keep repeating the need to uphold the values. But I think it's been great to hear the strong voices and the strong values that have come out this evening. I've certainly found it really very good. My Arabic isn't too good, but but I really liked your passion. Thank you.
Thanks. I certainly feel it's appropriate to give Mary the last word in the speaker series named in her honor. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to give a special thanks to my fellow board members of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, our staff. Thank you so much for the incredible work that you do. We have so many distinguished guests here. Thank you all for coming. We have a few undistinguished guests. They're mostly my friends in the back. But thanks all for coming. I want to thank all of our panelists. I agree with Mary. This has been an incredible collection of voices. Thank you, Rania, Saida, Nagi, Sarah Lee. Thank you so much. I'd like to give a special thanks to Mary Robinson, who's been such an important voice on business and human rights for so many years. Thank you, Mary. And we had Chris, a Brit, to welcome everybody in, and you have an American to usher you out. Please join us next door.